Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, in Sudan, rape as a weapon of war.
These are two generals who are fighting, two men, and who are the primary victims? Women.
The women and children who fled the conflict are still paying the price. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Just a heads up before we go on, this episode contains details of sexual violence. Staggering, horrific, trapped in a nightmare. In all the reports that have come out on Sudan's civil war, it's the scale of what's happening that looms the largest. It's forced more than 14 million people from their homes. More than half are women, according to the UN, and over a quarter are children under 5. Now, a UN fact-finding mission is reporting what Sudanese have been seeing for a long time. Rape is being used as a weapon of war on a massive scale.
Unfortunately, women are just the battlefield for them.
Omnia Mustafa is a Sudanese activist who spoke to AJ+. She used to live in Sudan, in the state of Jazeera, where some reports of rape have come from.
For the RSF, it's a way to break the spirits of people, A lot of times, they do it in front of the woman's family, in front of her husband, in front of her brother, in front of her father, in a way to, break the man, break their spirit.
Omnia is speaking of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. They've been fighting for control of Sudan against the Sudanese army for over a year and a half. The UN's independent international fact-finding mission for Sudan accused both the RSF and the army of sexual violence, but named the RSF as being behind the large majority of documented cases and responsible for sexual violence on a large scale. Neither the RSF or the army have responded to these latest accusations. As for Omnia, she says what she's seeing online from women in her home state is heartbreaking.
They do not respect women or see them as humans. And they also, unfortunately, it does not even stop just as rape. They have sexually enslaved women. They have taken women to places and continuously used them for 3 months and 4 months before. They sell women in markets.
For many women, the only way to escape with their lives is to flee. And many end up next door in Chad, where hundreds of thousands have crossed, with more arriving every day. My guest today has seen the impact firsthand.
Hi, Malika. My name is Dominique Hyde. I work for the UN High Commission for Refugees in Geneva, and I am the Director of External Relations in this organization.
Dominique, it's really good to have you here. Welcome to The Take. You recently returned from Chad, and I'd like to start with the story of one of the Sudanese women you met while there, 17-year-old Aisha. That's not her real name, but it's what you're calling her. She left her home in West Darfur after it was ransacked, and she fled to Chad with a large group of other people. Tell me about them. What happened to them?
I met Aisha about 10 days ago in eastern Chad. I met her by accident in some way. I was just talking to her, and she told me the horrific story she had just survived. She came from El Janina, which is in Darfur, and her house was ransacked. Family members were killed, and with about 180 people from her community, she fled El Janina to find safety in Chad. En route, she saw so many people in her group being massacred. Out of the 180 that were fleeing with her, 157 were killed, were massacred. All of the women were raped. Of the ones that survived, 6 committed suicide, and a woman that was also raped, pregnant, gave birth on the side of the road, died in childbirth. And Aisha took the baby with the 9 other surviving members to Chad.
Wow.
So out of 180, Malika, 180 people who were just trying to seek safety, only 10 made it to safety. And that's one story of so many I've heard.
Of those who survived the massacre en route to Chad, all of the women were raped. I just have to sit with that for a moment because it is a horrifying reality to try to come to terms with, to hear, let alone to have lived. And perhaps even more so horrifying when you realize that so many women fleeing their homes in Sudan have similarly tragic stories. You've seen the recent report from the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for Sudan, which details the sexual violence being perpetrated in Sudan. What stood out to you the most about its findings?
The report came out in September. It was commissioned by the Human Rights Council. I can't speak to the report, but I can speak to the horrors that I heard, story after story, of the women and children which have fled Sudan. 90% of the communities that have left are women and children. And the majority tell us of stories of gender-based violence, of rape, of gang rape, children being murdered, entire families erased, obviously famine-like conditions, and the like. So I would say that at this point, from what I heard, we need peace. We need it quickly. We need a ceasefire. We need justice to be brought to these women, to these families, and quickly.
There are reports of women committing suicide, both to avoid sexual violence and in the aftermath of that violence, like the women you mentioned earlier who fled with Aisha. What do you know about how prevalent suicide is, and what have you heard from the families of assault victims?
So I don't have the numbers, but we know it's prevalent inside Sudan. It's as a consequence of being raped. That is one of the multiple reasons that you're seeing suicide so prevalent across the country. And we are also hearing, and I heard personally stories of women who had been raped and who also were committing infanticide. And basically, out of the trauma and the stress for the whole family of having been raped and then actually carrying to birth a child, these crimes are also happening, and it's terrible for the entire family.
I'm thinking back to the story you told of a baby being born on the side of the road, the mother dying, and Aisha taking that baby to safety in Chad. What happens next? What is the trajectory for both Aisha and for that baby?
So good question, Malika. So Aisha was able, thanks to the help of my organization, UNHCR, to find the uncle of that baby. And they were able to reunite the uncle and the baby. And you can imagine, I guess, the relief for Aisha, but also the happiness of the uncle to be reunited with a family member. For Aisha, the story is much, much different. She will remain a victim of what happened to her, of what she saw, till justice is brought to her. But what I think is so important for your audience to understand is that importance of safety. Person after person that I met were so grateful for the moment that you cross that border, that you reach Chad, you reach that sanctuary, and they are safe. I met this woman as she crossed the border, Miriam. She crossed with her children, and she hugged me. And not that the hug is important, but just out of sheer stress relief of reaching a place where she could finally sleep, where she would finally find food for her children, and where hopefully the atrocities that she had gone through, 7 men in her family were killed in front of her. Her house was looted. She had no more food for her children. And in order to reach Chad, it took her a few days hiding here and there to finally reach that safety. So I think the first thing that we do at HCR is welcome them with the government of Chad in this case, but it's the case in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Ethiopia, Egypt, Libya. It's over 3.1 million Sudanese who have fled, and other people who have fled outside of Sudan to seek refuge. And over 11 million people inside the country who have had to flee their homes because of the utter violence that is taking place in the country.
You mentioned the story of Miriam and just her sheer relief and likely elation at seeing and finally tasting freedom. What is it like when people are fleeing and they're trying to head, let's say, to Chad, where you were? What greets them? How do they know when they've reached the border? What happens at the border? What is that process actually like?
So they reach the border. And my colleagues from UNHCR we have protection colleagues that receive them. First of all, we ensure that they don't need medical treatment, and they are brought to a temporary settlement in Adre, where I was, which is usually a city of about 40,000 people. It now has over 230,000 refugees who have arrived since the beginning of the conflict 19 months ago. They are put in temporary shelters where they're supposed to be moved after 60 days to settlements across the country where they can restart their lives. Unfortunately, we are so underfunded that they stay in this precarious situation for much longer. And that's a real issue because especially for these women and families who have been victim of so much trauma, they need mental health support, they need psychosocial support, they need medical help right away, and they need to actually resume a normal life, such as going to school, so that they can slowly, regain a bit of hope.
After the break, more with Dominique. Well, Dominique, you gave a press briefing upon your return from Chad at the UN in Geneva, where you are, last week. And you noted that in October alone, 60,000 people crossed the border into Chad, carrying nothing, you said, but their memories.
Their memories of unimaginable violence that they've witnessed and survived.
You were there to document and to bear witness to those memories. You've told us a few of the stories, but what else do people tell you?
So you're absolutely right. 60,000 people in 1 month. That's up from 20,000 in September. The reason for that is clearly the increase of violence happening in the country, in Sudan. I'd say another story that really touched me and that hurt, and I've told you stories of women, of my mother. I met a young boy called Mohammed, 14 years old, full of life, but just had gone through something no human should ever go through. He was also in his house in El Janina with his mother, with his brothers, when his house was attacked. Gunmen came into the house, shot him, shot his knee. His mother, a very frail woman, took him on her back and carried Mohammed on her back like any mother would do. We would all, just want to save our son. Carries her on his back 7 hours of walking to reach safety with her brothers. And the 2 brothers are killed. They reach safety. He's gotten medical support. He's gotten rehabilitation from Handicap International. But so much more is needed for Mohammed. And I asked him what he was hoping for. He says, I want to become a doctor. I want to be able to help other children, people like me, who've suffered this such an atrocity. So that's the memory that he will carry for life. And he will carry for life the memory of his mother that carried him. But what happened was that he lost his 2 brothers en route.
I'm so sorry.
How do you recover?
After surviving through everything you've just described, Sudanese refugees reach this safe space in neighboring countries. And for so many, that is Chad. But the obstacles don't necessarily end there. So what challenges did you find most pressing when it comes to helping and protecting women and girls specifically?
So I'd say there are many challenges. They are multiple challenges. First of all, they need shelter. So we need to quickly provide that shelter. The second is obviously that their vulnerability doesn't just stop the moment that they've crossed that border. They still need to be supporting their families. They still are victims of trauma. They are still scared and they don't know what's next. So that psychosocial support that I've spoken to is so critical. But they also are seeing their children hugely malnourished. They need to see their children thrive. And right now they're arriving not just disheveled, but malnourished in almost famine-like conditions. And, it's quite extraordinary if you think of it, Malika. 20 years ago, the same story happened in Sudan.
Time and again, the region has been devastated by fighting, which the local population claims is the work of Miseria militias, armed by the government.
But 20 years ago, there was maybe no podcast like we have today, but the world was speaking about what was happening to the people of Sudan. And today, we are simply not hearing that advocacy for more peace, for justice to happen, and for a ceasefire that is so much needed.
Well, I want to pick up on what you said about 20 years ago, this really being a prevalent topic. I remember being bused from one side of the country here in the U.S. to Washington, D.C. to go to protest for Sudan. There were celebrities backing this. George Clooney, of course, was one of those big names trying to end the atrocities in Sudan.
If we turn our heads and look away and hope that it'll all disappear, then they will. All of them, an entire generation of people. And we will have only history left to judge us. This is, in fact, the first genocide of the 21st century, but there is hope.
When it comes to 2024, you've said that one of the things that you won't be able to get out of your mind, and you said this in that press briefing in Geneva, is that what's happening, particularly in Darfur, is happening without witnesses. So I want to talk about the challenge of access in Sudan, because we've heard these reports. We've heard reports of sexual violence for some time over the course of this more than a year and a half long war from activists, from survivors, but only recently have we seen it formally documented by UN bodies. What is access like?
So we have at UNHCR and other UN organizations as well, we are inside the country. We have colleagues that are doing their best and trying to access as many parts of the country, but we don't have access to all parts of the country. The breadth of horrific and brutal crimes that are taking place across Sudan, we're not everywhere. We're not able to actually to watch. We are asking for this ceasefire. We're asking for access, and we're asking for simple things like just bringing some of the vital support that is needed across the country.
What, though, for you is the difference between 20 years ago and today, especially when we all have these devices in our hands in which we can see the atrocities unfold before our very eyes? Why are there no witnesses?
I've been asking myself the same question. I've been asking myself, why 20 years ago did the world care? Why 20 years ago did so many voices raise the alarm bell for what was happening to the victims, to the crimes that were taking place, and what's different today? I think what we are seeing in the world I live in is the number of emergencies increasing around the world. The number now, last year, I think we said over 40 emergencies. And I think that there's a point where the world says enough, and they're not able to take in any more stories of the like. They don't know what they can do.
Yeah. Well, finally, Dominique, now that you've left Chad, what still remains with you?
I think the story of Aisha remains with me. Her story and that of so many women and girls that I met that survived the same atrocities. And I feel compelled to tell their story. I feel compelled to coming back to my organizations, to the governments I meet, to the civil society actors that I meet to say, we must step up. We cannot forget the Sudanese people. We cannot forget Aisha or all the sisters like Aisha.
And that's The Take. What other stories about Sudan would you like us to cover? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all of our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. We'll be back on Monday with guest host Natasha Del Toro.